Welcome to For the Record with Greenwood Law.
Hey everyone, welcome into an all-new episode of For the Record with Greenwood Law with attorney Dylan W. Greenwood, the founder of Greenwood Law out in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm your host, Mike Leon. Dylan here is a criminal defense attorney. He's been representing clients in both state and federal court, known for his high-level, personalized representation and hands-on approach to every case. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about that difference between state and federal court. I'm sure a question Dylan hears all the time: why does it matter so much to defendants in the state of North Carolina? So Dylan, it's good to see you. You know, you've practiced in both of these systems with respect to state and federal. How would you describe the main difference between a state court case and a federal one to someone who's never been through either?
Well, Mike, that's a great question. So they differ a lot in really three respects. One, the timeline of how the case might progress. Two, typically the subject matter at issue. And then the third would a lot of times comes down to the harshness of the penalties. Not all the time, but typically the federal system does skew a lot harsher because of the federal sentencing guidelines as compared to the structured sentencing that we have here in the state of North Carolina.
So let's talk about the type of offenses that tend to kind of stay at the federal level versus going to the state level. Can you break that down?
This is something that I have to explain quite a bit in my job because we live in a dual sovereignty country. So you're under the sovereign aspects of the state that you live in, but also the sovereign aspects of the country you live in. And each one of them has crimes that they can prosecute. And there are overlaps in the types of crimes. So a lot of federal crime centers around drugs, guns, some sex cases, also stuff involving immigration-related issues in the sense of like illegal reentry type stuff. And then there can also be stuff related to threats or assaultive type things when it's at a federal level. Now, that might at first blush sound like it is very similar to the state. And in some ways it is, maybe in name. But when it comes down to the substance of it, usually what differs is the seriousness. So take a drug case, for instance. Drug case in state court, a lot of times, is a possession with intent to sell and deliver. That's never going to make it to federal court. When you get a state drug trafficking case, there's a chance. But it usually has to tick boxes. And a lot of times it's based upon the amount of drugs involved, whether or not there were guns involved, whether or not it was a part of a bigger organization. I mean, there are any number of factors on why it might be federal versus not. Because the federal system, unlike the state system, the U.S. attorneys, who are the prosecutors, have the ability to be more involved directly with the investigatory part of a case. And so if they are working through a potential organization or an organized drug ring, for instance, then it's literally like working up the ladder or working up the pyramid when it gets down to it.
So let me ask you, because it falls into a follow-up perfectly, which was you touched on the investigations. Mm-hmm. Break it a little bit more down, like the difference between working with local law enforcement compared to like an agency like the FBI and the DA that's got bigger resources.
Sure. So I tell people all the time, U.S. Attorney's Office has the best investigatory force in the world. I mean, they really at their disposal. It's, the FBI, DEA, ATF, Homeland Security, pick any alphabet-related organization you want to, and they've got them at their disposal. What differs there, and is usually the length of the investigation. Usually it's the tools available during the course of the investigation. It's the ability to have foresight with the investigation. Not all the time, but it's more of playing a game of chess versus checkers. Now, that's not to say that state officials do not do a very good job at investigating their cases. But there's a difference when you have that U.S. attorney involved and the mindset is during the course of an investigation, within the course of it, what our next steps will be beyond just the person right here we could potentially prosecute. That happens more with the federal system than it does with the state system. Now, I'll also say that federal investigations do use a number of task forces. So there's like a sex crimes oriented task force. There are drug task forces where you have local law enforcement that can also be deputized as federal law enforcement as well. And it's a joint task force where they work together to do stuff.
So, Dylan, what about the court procedures themselves? I'm sure they're intimidating at both aspects, but what should clients expect to feel? Will they feel a difference the moment they walk into, let's say, a federal courthouse versus a state one?
Oh, it's different. I mean, it's even different from the attorney's perspective. It's more formal. Even the court, like physically itself, looks more formal. You walk in, you go, I know I'm in a federal courtroom. But the procedure itself also is very formal and very structured as it compares to the state system. The federal system is very lockstep in a lot of ways. State court feels like a wide open field at times where you don't know necessarily where it's going to go. And then you might see where you need to go on the horizon, but any way to get there, there's a lot of different ways. The other thing about this particular district that I operate in, mostly the Middle District of North Carolina, we have very strict procedures for scheduling. So the cases they move quickly, relatively speaking, when it comes to a federal case, especially when you compare that to a state drug case or just a state case in general. And I use drugs as an easy example because it's easy to juxtapose those two. So like in a state drug case, for instance, it might last years. That's harder to do in the federal system. It's more likely to last months than it will be for years. Now, that being said, the investigation has probably gone on 4 years. And then I get the year's worth of investigation to try to go through in a very short amount of time and figure out what's going on and where we need to go with the next steps for our clients. But that's what we do.
You mentioned a moment ago about sentencing guidelines too, and the rules. Those vary between the two systems. How much can you explain some of that and how much flexibility judges have in each of those instances?
Yeah, so there's a few key differences that I can think of just off the top of my head. One, in the state system, 9.999 times out of 10, if you're adjudicated guilty, that day is the day you're going to get sentenced. And when you're sentenced, you're typically fall into structured sentencing, it's a chart. So whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, you have some points that are given to you based off your prior criminal history score, and then your offense, whatever you were adjudicated guilty of, falls into usually a letter or a number. And then you line those places up on the grid, and it gives you a few different sentencing ranges to look at. There's a mitigated range, a presumptive range, and then an aggravated range. And then different factors put you within those ranges. Judge hands down the sentence, and it goes from there. Federal system's different in the sense that if you are found guilty or you change your plea to guilty, your sentencing probably is not going to happen for another 3 months. Because under the federal sentencing rules, a pre-sentence report has to be drafted. That is an extremely important document, one that our judges rely heavily upon during the course of sentencing. And it lays out almost everything about your life in a 15 to 100 page document, okay, on top of what is alleged to have happened or what you were found guilty of. And from there, it helps calculate on this huge table, all these points where you go up and down and feels like backwards and forwards a little bit. But that total score is an offense level score, and they can get big pretty quick because of some of the ways you can enhance a sentence under the federal sentencing rules, where yeah, you may be adjudicated guilty, but maybe associated conduct for which a court only has to find by a preponderance of the evidence that you committed can all of a sudden enhance that even more. And then your criminal history category is also calculated on top of that. You still line it up on a grid, and then from there, a judge uses that as a something that they need to find, but it is not mandatory that they follow it anymore. It's something that they use more as a guideline rather than a hard and fast rule. And then from there are additional rules on whether or not a judge can go up or down, or whether or not there's mandatory minimum sentences involved.
Dylan, let me ask you, have you ever worked on a case where maybe that line between state and federal issues wasn't clear? And if so, how'd you manage both sides of that process?
We do that quite a bit, especially when it comes to drugs and our sex cases, because sometimes you want one to go one way versus the other. To be very candid and blunt, a lot of our sex cases, we would much rather stay in state court. There are certain factors that we find that typically lead the feds to get involved with one of those cases. And it usually is a very fact-specific thing to that case. Usually involves the amount of material potentially involved, the subject matter of the material, that sort of thing. Okay. Now with drug cases, there have been a number of relatively recent changes in law that could skew us to want a case to go federal versus stay in state court. Because of the way North Carolina approaches drug trafficking sentencing, it can be really, really, really harsh. In fact, sometimes it is more harsh than the federal system. There are actually mechanisms in place in the federal system that allow you to alleviate yourself from the mandatory minimums. It's called a safety valve. And then if you could tick all those boxes off, which it's easier to do in the federal system than it is in the state version of it, then all of a sudden you can argue for everything below the mandatory minimum. And for instance, I've had a case before where my client was facing about 235 months in prison. We got it down to 18. Now that's rare. That is not the norm by any way, shape, or form. And there were a lot of extenuating factors. But without that safety valve, that would have never been possible.
Dylan, what about communication, especially with respect to prosecutors in each of the systems? Are like plea discussions, for example, how are those handled differently at the state level versus the federal level?
So, I would say the approach is similar in the sense that, yes, you negotiate back and forth. I find that in the federal system, a lot of the negotiation occurs with removing charges or maybe sentencing someone under a different version of a drug statute so that the mandatory minimum is potentially less or the maximum is less, which matters if you think steps ahead. If this person were to ever, get out of prison, go on supervised release, and then potentially violate, a judge can potentially keep you on supervised release for a long period of time. And if you're under the harshest versions of the drug statutes, then that can be up to life, really. But under different versions of that statute, they're capped. So those are things that we look at. I would say there are a lot of times more areas for wiggle room in state charges, not all the time, but a lot of times, in the sense that there are more mechanisms within state court for deferred prosecutions, conditional discharges, expunctions, that sort of thing that could give people some form of alleviation from, the potential punishments that they might get in their case.
So Dylan, as we land the plane on this episode, for someone who's listening to this right now, maybe their case just got moved to federal court. What's the most important thing that they can do right now as they start to prepare for what's ahead?
So I would actually back up. If there's any possibility that the case could go that way, you need to have an attorney that knows how to navigate that ether between the two systems, first of all. And if you don't have that, if you're kind of on the back foot there and you're trying to make the best of it now, having somebody that knows how to, I guess, make that a softer landing and reach out to the people that are going to impact your case quite a bit can have a great impact, because there are ways within the federal system to turn people in a more controlled fashion. There are ways to do that so that maybe there's recommendations for release, or I will say, if there's enough foresight, maybe there's the ability to reach out to people and say, someone is willing to be cooperative in one way or the other. And that might have a drastic impact on the next steps that happen in a case. We've had that quite a bit from somebody who's willing to either provide information or perhaps willing to work with the government to be some sort of confidential informant. That's not all the time, and I'm not saying that's something we necessarily push, but it is an option, and it's an option some people are very willing to take, obviously weighing the factors in their lives and everything. I get that, but being able to make those moves early on matters.
Dylan, thank you for the time and insights on this. We truly appreciate it.
You got it. I'm very happy to be here.
And that's it for today's episode of For the Record with Greenwood Law. Look, if you want to learn more about attorney Dylan Greenwood, the work that he does over at Greenwood Law, do me a favor, visit dwg-law.com. You're going to find the helpful resources about criminal defense in the state of North Carolina, state charges to federal cases. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review and comment, or share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.